Lots of times when you study a book, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, why was this book even written? Well, John comes out and tells us why this book was written in John chapter 20 as he's concluding the gospel. He says there, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." There's a lot of things that we can learn from this particular declaration. First of all, John says that this book is a book about signs. And what he said is Jesus did many other signs, but these are written. There are other words the Bible uses. In Acts chapter 2, Peter describes Jesus of Nazareth was being certified by God, who performed miracles, wonders, and signs. So a miracle is a significant event which requires the working of a supernatural agent. In other words, something only God could do. A wonder. What's a wonder? Right? 7 wonders of the world. It speaks to the effect that those things have on the observer. These events were what John focuses on, signs. So when you see a sign and you stand under a sign, for example, the Chicago Theater, if I go and I stand under that sign, have I reached my destination? No. The purpose of the sign is to show me how to find the thing that I'm looking for. As I walk down State Street, how do I know where the theater is? I look for a sign. A sign can also give us information. It can tell us the showtime, who's performing, hours of operation. John says these things that are written were written for a purpose. The feeding of the 5,000 is a sign that is recorded in every one of the Gospels. But in John's Gospel, Jesus explains the significance of the feeding of the 5,000. In John chapter 6 and verse 35, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger." The purpose of why Jesus fed the 5,000 was to illustrate something. That just as Jesus could feed the multitudes physically, he also provides eternal, spiritual nourishment. He is the bread of life. And this is a book of signs. What is interesting is that even though this is a book of signs, there are only a few which are covered. In fact, in total, there are about 37 different miracles recorded in the Gospels that in the 4 Gospels that Jesus performed. But John is very selective about which ones are included. Even though this is a very lengthy book, he only records 7 of these signs. And what he says is Jesus did many others, but these are written. Right? These 7 signs. And this is a large focus of what the first half of the gospel is all about. The changing of water to wine in chapter 2. The healing of the official son in chapter 4. The healing of a lame man at the pool in chapter 5. Chapter 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000 and him walking on water. Chapter 9, we have him healing a blind man, and in chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. 7 signs. 7 signs that serve a purpose, that provide information. John covers less material than the other Gospels do, but he goes into deeper about what the meaning is. One that explain who Jesus is himself. Another important thing that we see is that these signs were done in the presence of his disciples. This is a book about eyewitness testimony. Signs done in the presence of multiple disciples, multiple eyewitnesses, but only one of them is writing these down. And we know that the list of candidates is pretty small. Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James and John, and 2 other unnamed disciples. And what we see is that as Peter and Jesus are walking, there's a reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved. So we know it's not Peter. So this reference is made several other places as well, including the upper room where we know, so therefore we know it's one of the 12 apostles. The author also confirms that this disciple is indeed the one recording these eyewitness events. So we know Peter, James, and John were part of the inner circle. They were at the Mount of Transfiguration. And they were the only ones allowed deeper into the garden when Jesus went to pray. Now, John is not mentioned anywhere by name in this book, despite being part of that inner circle. So every serious student agrees that the disciple whom Jesus loved was in fact John. And the reason why he calls out the one that Jesus loved was not to brag, but to identify that he had eyewitness testimony to key events. As close to Jesus as a person could be to be able to provide eyewitness testimony. At the Last Supper, sitting next to Jesus, he can just lean over and ask, who will betray him? He is a beloved disciple. He was the one at the crucifixion, standing at the foot of the cross with Mary, Jesus' mother. At the resurrection, it's John who runs with Peter to the tomb. As close to Jesus as a person could be, providing eyewitness testimony of key events. They can identify that Jesus was indeed the Christ, the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of God's promises. Why does it matter that we have the best eyewitness testimony from those that were closest to Jesus and they'd actually observed these key events? The reason is because it's a matter of life, a matter of eternal life. Many other signs were done in the presence of his disciples, which were not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Why is this eyewitness testimony a matter of life? Because of what that message is. What are they testifying about? That Jesus is the Christ, the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of all of God's promises in the Old Testament. Andrew finds his brother, Simon Peter, and he says, we have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ, and he brings him to Jesus. And that is what we see being presented time and time again, especially in the first 4 chapters, people being asked to consider, is this the Christ? But not everyone is willing to accept that Jesus is the Christ. In chapter 7, many could look at the signs and see that Jesus was the Christ. And they see him speaking boldly in the temple. And they ask, do the religious rulers know this is the Christ? And we see that there is controversy, right, between those that can see the signs that he is the Christ and others who say he does not fit their understanding of who the Christ would be. The Christ would come from Bethlehem, not Galilee. The Christ would come from the seed of David, not a carpenter's son. Right? This does not fit our understanding of who the Christ is. But the people could look at the signs that were being performed. And they ask, when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than these which this man has done? If this is not the Christ, what more is somebody going to be able to do to be able to show that they are? So the purpose of the signs recorded here are to demonstrate that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Son of God. Sometimes that phrase is being used as being just synonymous with Christ. What we see is in John chapter 1, when Nathanael encounters Jesus, he says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Right? You are the Christ, the one sent from God. But Jesus makes it clear when he says he is the Son of God, that it is so much more than just someone who is sent from God. In John chapter 5, Jesus talks about the works being done. And he uses the phrase, my Father is working until now, as I am working. When he taught the disciples to pray, how did he instruct them to start? He said, our Father. But when Jesus talks about himself, he says, my Father, not our Father. There is a relationship that Jesus has with the Father that nobody else has. And the religious leaders knew that he meant more than that. Therefore, the Jews sought all the more to kill him, not only because they thought that he broke the Sabbath, but because he also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. John says these signs are recorded by eyewitnesses. They attest to the fact that Jesus is not only the Messiah, but that he is in fact God himself. So clearly do these signs demonstrate this, that in John chapter 20, the concluding section, what we see is Thomas, who we call Doubting Thomas, now Believing Thomas, proclaims him as my Lord and my God. That is the purpose of this eyewitness testimony, to produce faith that these claims about Jesus are truth. He says many other signs Jesus performed, but these are written. These are written so that you may believe. The purpose of this writing is to produce faith that Jesus is indeed the Christ and God himself. And yes, this gospel was written to produce faith, but it was also written to reinforce faith. These things are written so that you may hold on to your faith. Well, why would John feel that we would need to do this? Well, 3 times in John's gospel, he talks about the possibility of people being thrown out of the synagogue. In John chapter 9, we have the story of Jesus healing a blind man. And they ask the parents how this happened. And the parents refused to answer, because the religious leaders had declared that anyone that confessed that Jesus was the Christ would be thrown out of the synagogue. And this is more than just like not being allowed to go to a church building, right? The synagogue was the center for Jewish life. It was like being expelled from the community. And even though a great miracle had occurred, there was a high price to be paid for those that made the declaration that Jesus was the Christ. In John chapter 12, it says, nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. In John 16, he talks once more about this, right? The time would be coming when they will put you out of the synagogue, when they will cut you off from the community, where they will break the ties with those that you care about, where they'll even kill you. It is going to get hard. If somebody's not a Christian, just considering Jesus, hopefully this study will help convince them to make the decision to follow him. But most people have already believed on him that are going to be looking at this video, right? The point of the book, of what John is writing out, is it's tough, and it's going to get tougher. And John says the point of his writings are that you will hang on to your faith. We read about Gamaliel in the book of Acts. And what we see there is that his grandson added a curse to the prayers that were recited in the Jewish synagogues. It says that for the apostates, let there be no hope, and may the Nazarenes and the heretics perish in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living, and let them not be written with the righteous. People were told if they followed Christ, they were accursed. People were going to have to make hard choices. And John says, I know that this time is coming. And I've written these things down so that you may hold on to your faith. From this standpoint, we can all relate to this gospel. Right? We live in a time where there is a lot of opposition to Christ's teaching, and it's not going to get easier. 1 John chapter 5, John would later write, "These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God." Right? There's going to be coming a time in your life where you're going to have to make a choice. Are you going to want to hang in there? Is it going to be worth it? Why is it worth it? The reason is because Jesus gives us life. Jesus brings life. John chapter 3, verse 16, "For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." He even points out the importance of this again in chapter 3 and verse 36 when he says, "He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him." John says, I know that this is going to be difficult. Hang on to your faith. It is a matter of life and death. It is important to hang on to this belief as Peter did. When it seemed like everyone was turning their backs and rejecting him, and Peter said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." The reason we can trust Jesus is he has the words of eternal life. It's his story did not end in death. It ended in life and glory. He was raised to glory, and it was all part of God's plan. John chapter 12, "My soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And then a voice came from heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." Jesus' path was a road of suffering, but he was raised to glory and eternal life. John says, pay attention to these signs. These signs are there to put faith for you in Jesus. And it is Jesus that gives us life. And this suffering was not just something theoretical, right? As he stood at the cross, at the side of Jesus, standing by his suffering mother, and he watched Jesus take his last breath. In Acts chapter 12, as Herod is persecuting the church, John's brother is arrested and run through with the sword because of his faith in Jesus. Even in his old age, John was exiled to a prison island. And what we see is he writes in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9, "John, both your brother and companion in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patience of Jesus Christ, was on the island that is called Patmos, because of his testimony of Jesus Christ." Why suffer so much unless this is true? John says it's going to be tough. This is a book of signs, things that were written so that you can hang on to your faith, so that you know you're making the right decision. And even if it winds up with a road of suffering, the end result is life and glory.